So I'm sat here with Peter Saunders, and we're going to discuss some of the history relating to the formation of the Blewbury Players. And in front of us we have a document that sort of sets out some of the early designs and plans. But first, Peter, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the Stockwell Players that preceded the Blewbury Players.
Well, there was a splendid couple in Stockwell called Herbie and Paulie's Lug. And Herbie Lug was in the theatre world. I'm not sure what he did. He may have been a designer, he may have been a director, but he was certainly very involved in theatre. Paulie's was a very wealthy lady, a European family, and there was a very large chemical company which also employed somebody who was very, very involved in the Blewbury Players in the early days and was very involved before that in the Stockwell Players, Robin Sewell, an absolutely key figure in setting it all up, and then one of our trustees and a key actor, and brilliant actor. And Paulie's and Herbie Lug retired to the country because they could do so because they had plenty of money, and got bored and said to each other, well, you're in the world, you've been in the theatre world, why don't we put on a play and ask all our friends down, because it's a large garden and so on. And this was in 1934, which happened to be the year that I was born. And that was the beginning of the Stockwell Players, which then went on very successfully for 40 years or so. It was not in any way like the Blewbury Players, because it didn't really involve the village of Aston Tyrrell, that it was and Aston Upthorpe. It just was really a hobby for Paulie's and Herbie, and it was the actors and everybody involved were friends, and the audience were friends, and probably people from the village came, but it was not a community activity in the way the Blewbury Players became, and in the way most things in Blewbury had developed in recent decades. But it was quite a high-powered set of productions, and they had quite well-known people in their time from the West End and from the theatre world to direct and to act in them. It went on more or less through the war. They almost always did Shakespeare, but during the war they couldn't do something as ambitious as that, so they did Springtime in Aston Tyrrell and things like that. But the last few years of Paul Lisa's life, after Herbie died, she carried on. Instead of Herbie directing it, she had various, again, rather well-known West End people to come and direct the plays, and again their friends and a few local people to act in them. And I was one of those local people, as well as quite a few other Blewbury people, some of whom, like Ron Freeborn, have been very, very, very involved in the Blewbury Players ever since. So that was the, if you like, our model, and we were aware of that, and it was a tremendous success. So a few years after Paul Lees died, and we had already done all sorts of crazy things in Blewbury as a result of the huge increase in population when Graham Close and Millbrook Close were built, and various other developments, Westbrook Green. And there were lots and lots of people who were raring to go, so to speak, and one of the things that we did was music halls and entertainments of various sorts in the old village hall, tiny, very, very decrepit building halfway up Nottingham Fee, and we were in the garden ourselves. I was in the garden with my wife and looking around, and we had planted lots of beech hedges all over the place and created, there was very little garden when we came, so we created what I hope was going to be a very interesting garden with lots of sections in it, a formal section, a less formal section, hedges, enclosures, and so on. And one of I had planted straight lines of beech hedging all over the place. I got fed up with planting straight lines of beech, so I planted a semicircular beech hedge, and that looked quite nice, and there were just a few fruit trees in it, and I was in it once, probably cutting the grass, And after Paulie's had died and the Stockwell Players was being forgotten, but was beginning to be a thing of the past, and I suddenly realised, gosh, what a fantastic shape for a theatre. We'd actually also dug a swimming pool at the time, and there was a mound of earth at the one side of this D-shaped hedge enclosed garden. And that again said, if we're going to have a theatre, you need some sort of tiered seating. The seating at Stockwell's was provided by a scaffolding structure, which wasn't exactly beautiful. And I thought, well, it would be quite easy just to bring in some more earth and have something like a little Greek amphitheatre. It wasn't a little amphitheatre at all, because we seat about 240 people. So there we went. We had some money left to us from Paulie's, who was still... was Paulie still alive at the time? I think it was. I think she was. Or possibly by Robin, who was one of her trustees. So we had some money from her, which helped get going, and we had inherited some of her lighting equipment and so on and so forth. And hey presto, within a year or so, we were doing our first production.
So this period of sort of the late 60s and early 70s was a very sort of changeable time for the village. Just going back to the Stockwell Players, so when did you sort of first move to the area and become aware of it and get involved in the Stockwell Players?
Well, we came to Blewbury the year after we were married in 1958. The Stockwell's productions ended in 1974. I guess we were involved in the Stockwell. It was a theatrical production in the next village to Blewbury, and I guess I think we went to the last 6, 7, 8 productions. I don't have the programme with me, but I acted in 3. Well, quite a few Blewbury people were acting with them by the time. I acted, and my wife was playing the recorder I just saw this morning in one of the in a little band in one of the plays, and at least one of my sons, as quite a small boy, was one of the fairies in the Midsummer Night's Dream and so on. And several friends, several people we knew in Blewbury quite well, had begun to act with the Stockwell Players. Including, as it turned out, me, although I didn't have much in the way of theatrical background. So I think we were involved in the last 4 or 5 or 6 plays at Stockwell's, and got to know the people involved there very well.
So this would have been sort of 1967 to 70, I suppose, when Blewbury's own theatrical ambitions were starting to sort of take hold.
That's right. Well,
and you mentioned earlier the sort of music hall type events that took place in the village hall. So this probably would have been, I don't know, late 60s. So could you tell us a bit more about those early productions before the formation of the theatre in Orchard Dene?
Well, the very first one was a marvellous, rather small-scale play, but it involved a lot of people considering the size of the village hall. It was very small indeed, and it was called Lord Arthur Saville's Crime. And I can't remember the details, but I remember that it was quite a success, and I think we did 3 performances and they were sold out. And that's the only sort of straight theatre that was done in those days. But when Graham Close was built, and it all does date back to Graham Close being built in the 1960s, the great thing about Graham Close is it was a terrific influx of energetic young people and a very, very good social mix. Loads of kids, loads of energy. It took a little while for them to become assimilated in the village, because it was a rather geriatric village in those times. When we started having children, we had 4 sons, and we were pushing prams around the village, and people were saying, gosh, I haven't seen one of those for a long time. Yet Graham Close was absolutely teeming with children. So there's a lot of energy, and in the early days, for example, I know that they booked the village hall, the old village hall, and turned it into, I think one year, a sort of Arab tent with huge swathes of fabric all over the place. and they had terrific New Year parties, and that was sort of semi-acting, if you like. And then gradually they moved into the village, and other people moved into Graham Close, and it was just a terrific influx of new blood into the village, which was badly needed. Loads of kids, so there was a school built, a new school built, because the old school house was far too small for the large number of children, and all of these splendid people really kick-started Blewbury again, if you like, with the music halls and with, I remember we had in the gardens of Ashbrook, just up the road from Graham Close, a lovely large garden, beautiful courtyard, and we had an Elizabethan evening where we sang madrigals in costume, standing on the village old horse-drawn farm wagon. That was a lovely occasion, I remember, and there was another evening there, really making use of the garden and making use of the skills and the musical and dramatic skills that were clearly emerging in the village as a result of this great influx of new blood.
So, having spoken about the influx of younger people into the village in the late 60s, and in particular Graham Close, but it was some years before the Orchard Dene Theatre was built, and you mentioned earlier on the idea of the building the beech hedges and the swimming pool. So if you could sort of, at what point did you sort of decide, actually, yes, we can definitely do a theatre here, and how did that all come about, and how long did it take?
Well, almost certainly when I was cutting the grass in the theatre, and in the D-shaped area that I had created by chance, and the presence of this great mound of earth on the side of it. I have no idea how the idea actually emerged, how I suddenly said, let's have a theatre. But certainly at that time, a lot of things were going on in Blewbury. The village hall was clearly nothing like adequate for what we wanted to do. We did begin also at that time to make use of the church. We had concerts in the church from young professional music or budding professionals from the Royal College of Music, many of whom remained very, very good friends and extremely distinguished in the field of music. And there were so many things going on, and there clearly wasn't a venue for it. We were aware of this extremely successful but slightly cliquey activity of a private venture in Aston Tyrrell rather than a village venture in Aston Tyrrell, but we saw what could be done in the way of outdoor theatre because several of us were involved in it. Mostly, like me, in extremely small parts, but including one or two other people who were able to do rather larger parts. And that combined with the skills that were clearly beginning to emerge, things like music halls in the old village hall, as well as the Graham Close only early New Year plays. We did another play in the village hall. That's one I've already referred to, I think, Lord Arthur Savile's Crime. That was the first straight play that we did, but we then did music halls in the old village hall, and they were terrific old time music halls, very, very successful. So there was a lot of sort of theatrical things going on, and the village hall wasn't an adequate venue. This was before the new village hall was built, which also isn't a particularly good venue for theatre. And the combination of that and the memory, the pretty fresh memory of the success of 40 years of Stockwell's, of Shakespeare in the garden or theatre in the garden, it all sort of clicked into place. I can't remember a eureka moment when it happened, but it was probably something like sitting and contemplating how much longer I would have to take to get this dratted beech hedge cut. I really don't know.
Because it was almost not going to happen, because I understand, and looking at some of the initial sketches and the aerial photographs, that it was initially earmarked for a housing development.
That's
part of the garden.
That's
Is that right?
Yes. When we bought the house, between agreeing to buy it and signing the contract, we discovered, obviously when all the searches were being done, that the development that backed on to our garden at Orchard Dene, or what was to be our garden at Orchard Dene, was going to have, I think, 6 or 8 bungalows built on it, and that's Millbrook Close. And that, instead of being a straight line, a sort of hammer-headed development with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I think, bungalows on it, it is going to be L-shaped, and the shorter leg of the L was actually the area, the bottom of the garden of Orchard Dene. And we really didn't want houses built there, since that was going to be part of a garden, and we had 4 children at the time. So we told the owners that, yes, we'd be very happy to that piece of land is included, but will they please withdraw the application that they had for planning? And although this is slightly the details of planning law at the time, it was a rather peculiar situation. Do you want this sort of situation? There was a rather peculiar situation that a plan was approved, I think, at district level, and then finally approved at the county level. And it had been approved at the district level, but not at the county level. And there was another potential problem at that time. Either there was a socialist government, sorry, am I allowed to say socialist?
That's still acceptable.
Labour government. Either there was a Labour government, or there was the possibility of a Labour government, which intended to make compulsory purchase orders on any land that had received planning permission, to ensure that the development should go ahead. So the last thing that we wanted to do was to have a lot of houses at the bottom of our garden. One of the attractions of Orchard Dene to us, with a large family, was that it had a large garden. So we really didn't want to buy it with a lot of houses at the bottom of the garden, so to speak. So we told the owners that we would definitely carry on, but only if they withdrew the planning permission. And because that was in between the approval of the planning proposal at the district level and the endorsement, the final approval at the county level, it had to be, we said, sorry, we won't go ahead unless you withdraw it in time, because it was, final approval was imminent. Which they did, of course, and that was that. We went ahead with the purchase, and as it turns out, the Millbrook Close contains some people who've been very strong supporters, as well as 1 or 2 who were slightly against in the early days, who were very strong supporters of our theatrical activities, which aren't entirely neighbour friendly, because we do have it's quite an intrusion into the neighbourhood. We have 8 weekends of rehearsal and then a week of performances, and that really is not too nice for some people who want to just have a peaceful summer. We're delighted that the sufficiently enthusiastic support and not too much opposition to something that gives a great deal of pleasure to a very large number of people, but it's also a considerable nuisance to a few others, which we've always been conscious about, and we've been rather worried about occasionally. But we seem to have come to terms with our neighbours, partly by making sure that they know exactly what's going on, and also making sure that they're invited to the first performance and things like that. So we try to be as neighbour-friendly as possible, which is, of course, essential in a community like this, in any community.
So roughly when was it built? What year was it? It's about 1970.
Well, the first performance was
1976.
So it must have been built in 1975. Yes, the first 1976 was one of the driest and hottest summers for a very, very long time. And the way we first built it, we built a retaining wall at the back of the semicircular area, brought in the earth, and then I suppose there was a bulldozer or something that made steps down from the top level to the ground level. I think there were four raised rows of seats, and then 2 rows of seats at ground level. and between these steps we just had a sloping earth area, and then the whole lot was turfed. And that was 1976, a blisteringly hot year. So all the grass died, and one way of making certain that a piece of land is really, really dangerous is to have completely dried out turf on it at a slope. And that was quite tricky that first year, because people were sort of shuffling along to their chairs and kept slithering down the slope into the row of chairs in front. So next year we were a little bit more sensible and removed all the turf, and instead of just having one retaining wall at the back of the theatre, we had proper brick constructed steps, so you couldn't fall off that quite as easily. So that was year 2, but the first year was a little dangerous from that point of view.
So tell us about how it all came together. So from the Stockwell Players, you would have had a lot of experience in putting together productions or seeing how they all came together. So how did it come together? How did you select who was...
Well, we started with people who had been involved with Stockwells, and in particular two people who were very, very close friends of Paulie's, had been involved in the theatre world themselves. They had both been quite successful actors in their youth, Robin Sewell and Michael Godley. And in the last 2 or 3 years, a friend in Blewbury called David Robedo, who wasn't a professional actor in the way that Robin and Michael had been, but was very keen on the theatre and was a very fine actor himself. And those three and I had been involved in the Stockwell Players, and talking about this possibility after my eureka moment of having created an area and an environment where we could actually have an outdoor theatre. It was essentially the 4 of us that got together and formed the Blewbury Players, which is a registered charity, and decided that we would continue the tradition of Stockwell Players. And Robin, who was one of Paulie's trustees, arranged that we should have access to the costumes, and we were given the lights, and I think they also, the trustees also gave us about £10,000 from Paulie's estate, which helped us with the initial costs of the building the theatre itself, the brick walls and so on and so forth. And by that time there were also a lot of Blewbury Players, of Blewbury friends, who many of whom came to Blewbury at the time that Graham Close was built, and who were involved in the various other activities that were already happening in Blewbury at the time, and some of which were theatrical, essentially theatre things, but not in a theatre. So the 4 of us trustees, and a lot of people without whom, of course, we couldn't have got anywhere, Blewbury people, we did our first play in 1976, which was Merry Wives.
Merry Wives of Windsor.
Yes.
And we've got in front of us a number of different programmes. So there's the one for Ring Round the Moon, which was the sort of 21st one, which was done in 1996, and the Midsummer Night's Dream, which was
1997.
Oh yeah, beg your pardon, 1997. Yeah. And then Midsummer Night's Dream in the summer of 2000. One of the productions that I became aware of was the not an Orchard Dene production, but one that took place in the church. And that was the Snow Queen, which I believe was in the winter of 1982 or 1981 or something.
Well, that goes back further than that, actually. There have been some theatrical productions in the church.
Yes. Well, what stood out was from that particular production, apart from its ambition, was the fact that it was televised at the time.
Yes,
and on YouTube and within the Blewbury app, there's a video of that recording. But there are lots of characters involved in that. So how did that come about?
Well, that wasn't the first of the operas. That wasn't the first of the operas. The first of the operas that we did was the Benjamin Britten Noah's Flood, which is the archetypal community opera. And I can't remember the exact year of that. We need to put the exact year of that in. And that was in the church, very much welcomed by the vicar at the time. And that is if anybody wants to do something in a community involving people of all skills, of all ages, especially musical skills, the Benjamin Britten opera, Noah's Flood, is an absolutely ideal vehicle. That was in the church a tremendous success, involving masses and masses of people of all ages. I had also, over the years, because of various people I knew at the Royal College of Music, I had arranged a number of professional music concerts in the church, mainly with young students from the Royal College of Music. And when we had done the Benjamin Britten Noah's Flood, which was such a success, we started to say, look, this is wonderful, we must do something like it. And I looked at all the community operas, in other words, full-scale operas, but performable by amateurs, by good amateurs. And there simply weren't any. There were small ones, there were ones that were really for professionals, even if on a very small scale. But there's nothing like the Benjamin Britten, which was for a combination of professionals, which could be done by good amateurs and complete amateurs who'd never acted or sung in their lives, and in particular masses of children, because obviously all the animals in Noah's Flood were children.
Yeah.
And that was a wonderful production, and we just couldn't find anything else like it. And I suddenly had the idea, well, if we've had these wonderful professional concerts from students of the Royal College of Music, why don't I contact the Royal College of Music and say, we don't want, we know some of your people and they're marvellous young musicians. What we're looking for now is a marvellous young composer. Could one of your students be asked to be commissioned to write an opera for us? And I telephoned the switchboard of the Royal College of Music, and I said, can I please speak to your professor of composition? And there was a little silence at the other end when somebody, and then the operator said, well, actually we've got rather a lot of professors of composition, which is maybe not too surprising for a college of music. So, I was so naive about it. And then I explained to her what we wanted, and she said, well, the person you want to talk to is so-and-so. So I phoned him up, and he was extremely helpful. And he said that, yes, it's a wonderful idea, and we'd love to support it, but there is no way. I can quite see that our students, of course, benefit enormously from being invited to do a concert in a church somewhere, and we do a lot of that sort of thing. But there is no way in which somebody who's studying composing could spare the many months that are required during his 3 years of study with us, taking that sort of time off to write a specific work, especially not associated with the Royal College of Music, is out of the question. So what you want is somebody who left the college a few years ago and is beginning to make his name, and his name is Richard Blackford. So I contacted Richard Blackford, who is now one of my closest friends and lives in the village, and said, Richard, how about it? I put it all to him, and he wrote for us an absolutely wonderful opera. Right. Richard Blackford had left the Royal College of Music a few years previously and was really beginning to make his name. He was working at the time with a very well-known composer in Montepulciano in Italy, Hans Werner Henze. I was introduced to Richard and told him about us, and he thought, gosh, yes, that's a wonderful thing. He was 3 or 4 years out of the Royal College of Music. I'd love to do that. And I can't remember how the specific idea, the subject came up, but the theme of the opera, the name of the opera, was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, a wonderful, wonderful medieval Old English poem. Very, very fine piece of literature, a highly dramatic story. And Richard also knew a very well-established writer and poet who was willing to do the libretto. So we commissioned Richard to write a community opera with the Benjamin Britten Noah's Flood as a model, but of course not musically as a model, but just from the point of view, the ability of the people taking part. And that was an overwhelming success involving huge numbers of people, loads of children, wonderful use of the church. And of course, churches in olden times were the only sorts of places that one could do things of that sort, great community ventures. And plays in churches were not at all unusual in the olden times. So that was the first and highly, highly successful opera that we commissioned. And that turned out to be the first of 5 commissioned operas over a period of 20 to 30 years. The second was, I can't say which is my favourite, because I loved them all very much and was deeply, deeply involved with all of them. But the second one, which was the Snow Queen, really put Blewbury on the map, because Central Television, as it was at the time, did a documentary programme of the village, commissioning and rehearsing and performing the opera, which we still enjoy watching that programme occasionally, because, oh, there's so-and-so, look at him as a child, he's now 28 or something. It was a huge success, and we then went on and commissioned some more, and then almost running out of steam, and a few years later we did the Benjamin Britten Noah's Flood again, with a new generation of people, a new generation of children, and so on. And I think probably 7 major musical ventures is enough for anybody's lifetime. So I can't see it happening again in the near future, because I was certainly involved in all 7 of them myself.
Orchard Dene is now owned, of course, by Zillah Laidlaw, who acted in the Players from a young age. So, and you moved out of Orchard Dene. So, could you tell us a bit about kind of how you came to sell the property, how Zillah came to be, how this all sort of that part of the history, I suppose.
Well, we lived at Orchard Dene. It was a wonderful, wonderful family house. Our family was brought up there. Very, very, very happy memories. But it was a large house with a large garden, and we were getting on, and it was a ridiculous house and garden to try and maintain into our older age, so we decided to put it on the market, and found ourselves another very, very beautiful house in the village, the charity schoolhouse. So we obviously put the house on the open market, and there was quite a lot of interest. And one of the people turned out to be very interested in it was Zillah Laidlaw and Al, who were house hunting at the time. And Zillah was not only somebody we had known since she was a child, but she had actually acted with us in the Blewbury Players at Orchard Dene, after which I believe it became her dream house. And I'm not surprised, because they had young children at the time. It is a dream family house. And to cut a long story short, they bought it. We never, in 1,000 years, thought that we would be selling the house. We could hardly sell the house put the house on the market on the condition that the purchaser continued with the Blewbury Players. That would have been asking rather a lot. I think it might have been quite difficult to sell. But it turned out that we found people who wanted to buy Orchard Dene, who already loved Orchard Dene, partly because Zillah acted there as a child. So, as I said, to cut a long story short, they bought it. And we had the amazing good luck of having sold something that was played a hugely important part in our lives to somebody else who loves the place as much as we do, and which is clearly playing as large a part in their family lives as it played in our family lives. And not only in Zillah, for example, Zillah's daughter is also a stalwart member of the Blewbury Players. The barn, which was another, we made sure that it was a village facility. It was obviously the headquarters, if you like, for the Blewbury Players from the point of view of rehearsals, especially when it was wet, and changing rooms and storerooms and set construction rooms, but we also made use of it in various other ways. We had music halls, we had jazz dances, we had one or two theatrical productions. It was again a very village asset, and it's now being turned into a very beautiful village home.
And it's lovely that the theatre continues to be used to this day, and as we sit looking ahead, well, fingers crossed the production will still go ahead as planned.
That's right.
With the coronavirus, but certainly the many more years and many more years of productions to come.
Well, what is extraordinary is that Stockwell's had a 40-year life. The Blewbury Players had a 40-year life when it was in our hands, and hey presto, Blewbury Players, the Orchard Dene is now in the hands of people who love the theatre as much as we did, and they're carrying on. Having found a purchaser for Orchard Dene who wanted to carry on with the Blewbury Players, as far as I'm concerned, is miraculous. There you are. That's the end.
Peter, thank you.